Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be looking at the Warzone Charadon supplement, and in this specific case, we'll be looking for the special Admech rules for the Army of Renown, known as the Defense Cohort. And before we dive into that, I'd like to mention that this video is made for the 8th edition codex, and a new video will be made once the 9th edition codex is released, as it's right around the corner. However, I did want to look at the army before and after the new codex, so that we can get an idea of how much has changed, and what kind of things change in ranking depending on the different codex editions, as I think my channel in a lot of ways will serve as a very interesting time capsule as time goes on. To begin with the Defense Cohort, I think it is an army build that is viable at a high level of tournament play, but as it's a rather new option, there isn't that much data available as of yet. So the majority of this video is going to be predominantly my opinion and speculation about what can be done with this kind of army build. To begin looking at the Army of Renown options, the first thing that you have to know is that they impose various restrictions on list building, and the Defense Cohort has some of the most extreme restrictions in that regard. So what are the restrictions for the Defense Cohort? The first restriction is that all units must be Admech and from the same Forge World, so you don't have any ability to include units from other armies outside the army, such as Inquisitors, and on top of that, you cannot include different Forge Worlds within the army, so that already cuts out many of the options that you have when being creative with some of your list building. Now the second restriction is even greater, and the second restriction is, as many may know, that you cannot include any Skitarii units within the army. And on screen, you'll see all the options with the restricted ones being crossed out in red. As you can see, there are quite a lot of units that are cut out of the army as a result of this, and far more units got restricted than I originally anticipated, because all of the vehicles are Skitarii piloted, and as such, they are not an option that can be included within the Army of Renown known as the Defense Cohort. And to condense down what you can use in this army, we can see here that what we have access to is all of the HQ choices, including Belisarius Call if it is a Mars list, the different Cataphrons being Cataphron Breachers and Destroyers, as well as the different Electro Priests being Fulgurites and Corpuscari. Then we also have the Servitors, the X-101 Servitor, and the Castellan Robots, as well as the Data Smith. So all in all, you have very few options to work with, but the options you do have are very powerful. The major thing that keeps this restriction from being overwhelming is that Cataphron lists build primarily out of Cataphrons and use Servitors as well as Castellans to fill out the list as needed. The downside is that all of the units end up being very high in points, and you're very restricted in terms of what options you do have, with the worst part being all transport options have the Skitarii keyword, and that really restricts how much you can use the Electro Priests, as for the most part, the Electro Priests are very vulnerable when they don't have any kind of transport available to them. When I first started looking at this army, I was hoping that the drill was not a Skitarii unit. However, unfortunately, even the assault drill is actually a Skitarii unit, so it cannot be included within this Army of Renown in order to deliver your Electro Priests into combat. That being said, there are different ways around this, such as strategic reserves. Now for all these restrictions, you do gain some upsides for taking an Army of Renown. For the upsides, the Cataphrons, Castellans, and Servitors gain the Extremist Sentinel protocols, which gives them a large durability buff in that any damage taken is reduced by 1 to a minimum of 1, as long as they are either completely within your deployment zone or completely within the range of an objective marker. And considering how many weapons have become damage 2 or greater in recent times, it is a surprisingly large survivability buff on units that are already rather tanky in many cases, and can be made even tankier with something like the Warlord Trait, Learnings of the Genitor, that can give Cataphrons a feel no pain save on top of a normal save, an invulnerable save, and the damage reduction from the Army of Renown. As such, this can make the Cataphrons incredibly durable, and the Castellans benefit from it as well, and in many ways the Castellans are also very tanky. In addition to the damage reduction, they also gain the ability to hold steady or to set to defend when being charged by an enemy, with hold steady allowing them to hit on a 5+ when firing Overwatch, and set to defend giving them +1 to hit in melee. I definitely think that you're going to be setting to defend more often than you are going to be holding steady, simply because of how Overwatch works in 9th edition, although both can be viable options, and it kind of depends if the unit in question is Castellans, Cataphron Destroyers, or Breachers. One downside of all this that I should mention is that the Cataphrons, Castellans, and Servitors that are affected by the Extremist Sentinel protocols are also restricted from gaining the benefits of any dogmas. Keeping that in mind, you still gain access to canicles, including the different special canicles for each Forge World from the Engine Warbook and the stratagems of the different Forge Worlds. This downside obviously keeps you from taking a custom Forge World, such as the Data Horde Forge World, for their Transnode power cores, as all of their benefits are tied to dogmas. However, the regular Forge World options are still very much in play. The top 3 Forge Worlds that I'd consider for the Defense Cohort are the Mars Forge World for Call and the bonus strength Canticle, the Rise of Forge World for the Cataphren Destroyer Plasma Stratagem, and the Lucius Forge World for the Invulnerable Canticle, as well as a teleportation stratagem if you wish to give some more mobility to the Electro Priests or get the Cataphrons or Castellans into position faster so that they can benefit from holding an objective. A couple other Forge Worlds I would consider are the Stygies 8 Forge World if you have large blocks of Cataphrons, as you can scout move them with the Stygies stratagem. There's also Agrippina, which I'm not a big fan of, but with the added durability, maybe a large block of Cataphrons will survive long enough to be brought back onto the table with the Agrippina stratagem of fresh recruits in order to swing the game. I'm still not entirely sold on the Agrippina Forge World, but it's definitely an option to consider. And one other thing to consider is Graia might not be the worst either, as you're not benefiting from the Dogma, but you do gain the benefit from the stratagem so you can interact with Psychers, and considering you can't take Crusaders or anything of that nature, the Graia stratagem does become a lot better. In addition to all of this, the Defense Cohort also offers a trait, a relic, and several stratagems. The trait isn't bad as it lets the Warlord pick a unit within 6 inches and give it objective secured, with the Extremis Sentinel models counting as double for the purposes of objective secured. This can really let you swing who holds an objective at times, but many times it won't matter quite as much, if not at all, because there isn't a contested objective in order for you to use this on. However, if you combine this with something like the Solar Flare Relic from the Lucius Forge World, you could give yourself much more benefit from this trait, as you can teleport your Warlord to an objective where he is needed instead of having him run over on foot. Although this isn't something you would take over the Holy Order Warlord traits, it is something you would take if you're able to take it off of additional Warlord traits using Mechanicus Locum. Although even then, there are other Warlord traits that are just as good, so it is something to consider, and it is something that can be good. I think it's definitely the best in Lucius due to the Solar Flare. For a relic, the Defense Cohort has the Forge Fire, which replaces the Volkite Blaster to upgrade it to have 50% more range, giving it a range of 36 inches, 1 extra damage bringing it up to 2 damage, and 2 armor penetration, bringing it to a total of 2 armor penetration, with 3 shots at a heavy profile. I really like this relic as it can make the Dominus a real threat when it comes to shooting, which gives the Dominus a little bit more ability on the battlefield instead of just being an aura support unit, which is something that it seems like all of our HQ choices get relegated to. So it's nice to see that they're finally getting some options in order to be more combat intensive. And the reason this relic really works is most of our normal relics are rather weak, so it's not hard to include this one unless you're in something like Lucius where you want the Solar Flare, because otherwise the only competition this relic has is something like Anzeon Pseudo Generator or the Audiocadiasis of Archenland. Both are decent relics, but neither of those relics are mandatory for an army build, so you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you take in that regard. Finally, the last thing the Defense Cohort offers is the stratagems. There's a total of 4 stratagems that they offer, and most of the stratagems, in my opinion, seem rather overcosted for what they do, but have a lot of flavor and a lot of interesting abilities that I think can really make some armies if the command point cost is reduced. The first stratagem on the list is called Citation of Ruin, and it costs 2 command points if there are 3 or less models in the unit, and it costs 3 command points if the unit has more than 3 models. What the Citation of Ruin does is it allows a unit to fire in close combat as if it was a vehicle, and it ignores the -1 penalty to hit for doing so. This is an incredibly good stratagem on the destroyers, especially if you're running destroyers, and I think this is one of the primary reasons you would go with the Defense Cohort over other options, because if you want to run a lot of destroyers, the biggest issue destroyers have is that they only have ranged weapons, and those ranged weapons are very powerful, but it's very easy to trap the destroyers in melee combat, and once a Cataphren destroyer gets trapped in melee combat, it's going to have a very difficult time of breaking out of melee combat. Meanwhile, something like the Cataphren breachers are not the worst thing in melee, and Castellan robots can already shoot within melee, so this is a stratagem that very heavily benefits the Cataphren destroyers and solves one of their major problems. So I definitely really like this stratagem, and I think it's something we need to see more of in the future. One thing I don't like about this stratagem is it is very expensive at 2 or 3 command points, and I really wish it was 1 or 2 command points, as the Defense Cohort is already very command points intensive, and you're incredibly restricted as it is. However, this is an incredibly good stratagem. The second stratagem that the Defense Cohort offers is the Bolster the Defenses stratagem, which costs 2 command points, and it lets you select 1 piece of terrain and give that piece of terrain light cover. If that piece of terrain already has light cover, that piece of terrain provides +2 to the save roll instead of +1, and it still does not affect invulnerable saves. I think this stratagem would have been a lot more interesting with Skitarii units, as I think it would be a lot more flavorful if you had rangers with arquebuses in a wooded area sniping outside of it, as opposed to having something like Cataphren destroyers or Castellan robots hanging out inside of terrain. However, I also understand what they're probably getting at is that they're using some kind of barricade in order to protect the Cataphrons and Castellans while being able to shoot out of it in improvised terrain as opposed to being somewhere in a field. Anyway, as it stands, you're only really going to use this in order to protect your Castellans or Destroyers or Multi-Melta Servitors, and if you don't have a position where you can place them and protect them using this, it's really not worth it to command points otherwise. However, when you do, it's a decently powerful stratagem, and it's one that you can make a lot of use out of. The third stratagem is called the Pre-Calibrated Purge Solution, and this one only costs 1 command point in comparison to all the others, and what this does is it adds +1 to hit for a unit in your deployment zone shooting at an enemy unit in your opponent's deployment zone. So this will only be useful in early turns or if your opponent has artillery in their deployment zone. Sometimes it'll also help you clear out an objective in your opponent's deployment zone if one happens to be there. All in all, this is a rather boring stratagem and a very limited one, but it's one that you can make use of. The final stratagem that is offered by the Defense Cohort is called Rad Bombardment, and this stratagem costs a total of 3 command points. And to state what this stratagem does in the simplest terms possible is that once a game, if your Warlord is on the table, you can select a location on the table and mark that location. Next turn in your command phase, enemy units within 6 inches of the marked point suffer D3 mortal wounds on a roll of 4+ on a D6. And in addition to that, on a roll of 6+, the unit gets -1 to their toughness as they are now covered in rad saturated debris. This stratagem really needed to be 0 command points as it's a one-time use stratagem that does not have a very big impact on the game unless you roll a 6, and at the same time, because there is a delay of 1 turn before the bombardment goes off, your opponent has all the opportunity to play around it, and as such your best bet would be to target objectives as you could potentially force an opponent off of an objective using this. However, in most cases, a unit holding an objective can usually risk taking D3 mortal wounds on a 50-50 chance that they even take them at all. If you happen to give them -1 toughness, then that's very good, but otherwise it's a very mediocre impact. So yeah, I think it's a really cool idea, and I think it adds a ton of flavor to the Defense Cohort, but I don't get the logic in terms of command points for this stratagem. And once again, because it's a one-time use stratagem, I think it should have been 0 command points and maybe had a restriction that you can only use it in the 2nd or 3rd turn. And if it was 0 command points, I think that would add a little bit more to the Defense Cohort and give people a little more reason to play it, as it would give you something that's a bit more unique. Anyway, as a whole, I think the Defense Cohort offers a lot of benefits to an army if you want to go Cataphron heavy to begin with, and I think if you're planning to play a lot of Cataphron destroyers, the Defense Cohort is something you should definitely consider. Now the issue is it is very restrictive, so there are going to be certain issues that do come up because of the units that you have to use, and you'll have a difficult time with certain objectives. Though with all of that in mind, I do think all the tools are there in order to make the Defense Cohort as a tournament playable army. Think of it as more of its own Forge World with multiple special stratagems than a generic buff to your units. Though on the other hand, it is very restrictive and a lot of their stratagems do seem to be a bit overcosted. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like and subscribe as it really does help the channel out. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this video or any of the other videos on my channel, please do share the content as it can help other players out in terms of buying and building an army. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, you guys are awesome people. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.